Hello. I'm Vicki Nichols Goldstein, the founder and director of the Inland Ocean Coalition, which is an organization that I started about 15 years ago to bring the ocean inland in the United States. And since then, it has actually grown internationally. So we have some really cool projects around the world. But I wanted to start out with just thinking about how amazing the ocean is, how beautiful it is, incredible biodiversity. It has such unique animals, and it is just a wonderful place. And how many of you, when you go to the ocean, can you smell it? Have you noticed that smell? And you notice that in different ocean basins, they all have different fragrances. And it's just something that is just really special to me. And the ocean can be kind of crazy and scary for many people, but it's also a place where you can enjoy it. You can go in it, on it, and under it. And it's something that honestly just brings me joy, and I hope it brings a lot of other people joy as well. And it's got its challenges, anything from overfishing and bycatch to water quality problems and discharges, plastic pollution, and of course, climate change, ocean acidification, coral bleaching, more and more and more. However, I feel like we still have a lot of hope. There are so many parts of the ocean that are amazing, and I think with community engagement and action that we can still protect and restore these vital ecosystems. But the real key is it's got to be community driven. And this is where my story starts. I'm a diver, and I've been going down to Roatan, Honduras for many years, and it is an amazing place. It's an island very close to the mainland, but far enough away that you don't have a lot of its impacts. And what's really cool about that is surrounded by the Bay Islands National Marine Park, and it really is a diver's paradise. And with that, it also has many of the island's challenges that you would find in other areas, because millions of people come down to visit that island, go diving, sport fishing, a number of other activities. So it is fairly impacted with humans. And during my time there, I had the opportunity to meet with many of the people who live there, work there. Nonprofit organizations, dive shop owners, dive instructors, different businesses. And there's a real deep sense of caring about the island and the culture and the people. And one of the things that I found was they weren't working together. You had these NGOs that weren't really connecting. They didn't trust each other. There was a lot of staff changes. They were doing things independently, and there really wasn't any kind of unified strategy. And so it was just kind of a piecemeal operation for trying to work in the world of conservation. But one of the things that I did find in talking with many people, they were really upset about the massive amounts of petrochemical sunscreens that people were using on the island and the impacts that the community was feeling. And they kind of felt, well, if we do an education campaign, which I wish one of the organizations would do, we could make some headway on this. But it wasn't really working because, again, they weren't synced up and working together. So I gathered some people up and said, let's see if we can do some brainstorming. So after about a year, because when you try to gather up people who don't trust each other and really don't want to be in the same room with each other, it took a long time to develop that trust. So there was a lot of skepticism, a lot of non-follow-up with each of the organizations. But after a while, it took about a year, we came up with this idea of Prove It's Clean. And we started to get the message out to the different people on the island. In addition, I brought in Dr. Craig Downs, who is a toxicologist and very well known in the sunscreen world for the harmful chemicals and the impacts that it has on the animals, including coral bleaching, damages to coral DNA, and deformities in the developing fish larvae and other organisms. So we were making good headway. We were feeling like we could really get the word out, and we decided to formalize that, and we developed the EcoSafe Sunscreen Coalition, which we brought in the 5 groups that were leaders in this initiative, and thought, all right, let's see if we can make some really interesting things happen. So we decided to go for a sunscreen ban. And if you look at the island of Roatan, on the western side, which is the white, it's the Roatan municipality, and on the other side, it's a different municipality. And the Roatan municipality is very progressive, and that's where they have many of the large hotels, and that's where the tourism industry is really active. And so there was also relationships with the governance there. So we thought, well, let's see if we can focus in on that area first. So we really got out there, started working with the community. The nonprofits got organized in a way that they started working together. We started doing presentations at schools. We decided to go to the university and start working with students. We would have beach cleanups and we would take photos and we would give free drinks to people who would stay and learn about the impacts. And it was just a real fun opportunity to get a lot of community engagement involved. And they were also learning about the different types of impacts of sunscreen and starting to spread the word. Whoops. Excuse me. And so we thought, okay, we had already gone to the municipality and they said, if you want to do any kind of a ban, you really need to engage the community and you need to work with the businesses and we need to know that you have their full support. So during this time, we went around and we got over 1,000 individual petitions, signatures with their individual numbers, submitted that to the municipality, and we had a lot of we had 60 letters of support, everything from gas stations up to the larger hotels. And we thought, okay, we've accomplished the goal. We did what the municipality wanted us to do, and we submitted it in October, and we thought we would get a ban in the municipality by the end of the year. But then there was a big stall, and we didn't know really what was going on. But at the same time, the Bay Islands National Marine Park, they were working on their management plan review, and they were having a lot of challenges with their fisheries and trying to incorporate all the public comments. But one thing that came out really clearly was people really wanted to see a sunscreen ban within the management park or in the Marine Park Management Plan. And so about 2 weeks ago, that management plan came out, and it was very clearly written in the documentation that there will be a complete ban on all petrochemical sunscreens throughout the entire island chain, which includes the whole island of Roatan, Guanaja, and Utila. And that was very surprising to us because we thought we were only shooting for that one little section. And it was really great that the whole national park and their efforts really coincided with the sustainability goals that the municipality of Roatan had. And it was a really nice illustration to us that if you have good science, you had community engagement, that you could really make large and meaningful change. And the effort we felt was really important, and we were very happy about it. But if you really look at the bigger picture, with the systems maps, you can see sunscreen is a great thing to ban, but there's a lot of factors and a lot of people that are involved in addressing the issues on the island, everything from community organizations, residents, expats, and government entities, the tourism industry, the cruise ship industry. So it's really challenging to really work this out and get all of the factors included. And we did that with the director of the Roatan Marine Park because she was really feeling frustrated in trying to bring all the elements together. And then we also had her take a look at the iceberg model. And clearly there are issues with contamination, pollution, sedimentation, especially after it rains or after construction. So those things are very obvious. But when you look underneath and really understand what's happening on the, within the system, you can see that there's a lot of cultural issues, systemic change, or systemic problems with attitudes. Just working with the different communities, with all the cruise ships coming in, and you just have a lot of the underlying power imbalances that make it a very difficult and challenging arena to actually manage. But in the big picture, we recognize that through this ban and through all the community engagement, that it really was significant. And I know personally, and I think all of us do, that banning sunscreen isn't really the answer. It's not really going to make a huge, enormous change in ocean conservation. But what it did was opened up trust and dialogue and allowed us to have many more conversations. So as we move forward in looking at how to implement this ban, but also how to address many of the other issues, which are even bigger. We have that trust and we have that community support to actually help us move forward. So I'm looking forward to hearing how the other panelists are also addressing these similar challenges. So thanks.
Thank you, Vicki. And you may notice we have the same last name. This is not a coincidence. So I actually originally trained as a forest ecologist, and then I went into conservation planning, and most of my work was above the tide line, as they say. But having married a mermaid and been with her for many decades, eventually I was going to be dragged from these waves. And so we're actually working together now. And sorry. We're working together now in Roatan and globally, combining our interests and our expertise. And so laying this foundation that Vicki just described in Roatan is intended to lead to the next generation of this project, which is what I'm going to describe the foundations for today, through a bit of a detour, admittedly. So let's see, I'll find my little PowerPoint here. There I am. And how to get this started? Well, how about this button right here? Da-da-da. Good. So, yeah, my background, my interests are in collaborative conservation, but specifically around how do scientists integrate themselves into complex conservation planning challenges, especially when it relates to efforts to lay the groundwork for social ecological transformations. So coral reefs are not only something of shared interest because we love them, but also I think from the transformations community's perspective, as David described this morning, they're I guess you could say the first major global ecosystem to undergo a broad-scale global collapse. And so, and hopefully not the last, but we know what the trends look like. And so from a broader perspective beyond coral reefs, we think it might be a laboratory to learn about how can we respond to these catastrophic global challenges as they emerge. What, if any, response is viable? David went over the challenges of coral reefs this morning, and I think this reinforces your message. This is from a recent paper by Tiffany Morrison et al. That just came out in Science. And the point of this graphic is to basically say that that novel interventions, scientific interventions, technical interventions that aren't done in association with governance interventions can often be undermine climate policies, undermine trust, lead to ethical dilemmas, and create division that makes it even more difficult to accrue the climate benefits. However, there is a virtuous cycle here on the other side, where it's possible to combine governance intervention and technical and scientific interventions in ways that actually reinforce the integrity of what we're doing, the legitimacy of what we're doing, and gain trust and gain social license. And so that's the spirit of the efforts that we're going to describe. So, as a sort of a neophyte in the coral world, I decided to go with Vicki to the Coral Futures Conference in Mexico. And I found out that they were doing this large-scale Delphi process throughout the entire workshop, the entire conference, that was engaging many scientists and practitioners and managers from the Caribbean reef system, the Mesoamerican reef system. And as someone who loves collaborative processes, I begged my way into the panel, and I offered to be of use if I could be. And they accepted me as their token or their pet social scientist. So I was able to sit throughout this entire meeting, and it was fascinating. It was probably about 12 hours total. So most of about half of the entire conference, where they combined a survey with multi-round discussions that looked at 6 different technical intervention challenges. And they ranked the interventions according to their risk and efficacy. And they divided up the days according to a researcher group, a practitioner, manager group, and then a mixed group in order to achieve a kind of consensus, or at least get a sense of what the community as a whole felt were the risks and the challenges and the efficacy associated with different novel coral reef interventions. And here's a graphic of those interventions, the kind of things we're talking about here. And David, I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of stuff, but for me, it was pretty exotic. Algal symbiont modifications. Wow. We're talking about some pretty out there stuff, and they're aware of how, experimental and how risky some of these interventions are, but there's a level of desperation and a level to try anything in the coral reef science community. So they were looking at a wide range of intervention possibilities in the Mesoamerican reef system. And this is just a summary of the people who participated. So it's really two graphics. So on the left, two sets of boxes. You can see there was a preponderance of academic and nonprofit participants, but there were some government folks. And on the right, region of focus and participants, you can see the division of where people come from. So there was maybe a third came from Florida, and the rest were scattered around the Caribbean. And so that was the composition of the people there. So this is the outcome, this matrix. And as you can see from the left, this is kind of how it's divided up. Ready for implementation were things that were identified as having both low risk and high efficacy, and certain novel interventions bunched up in the lower left. Whereas down here, you have chemical seawater manipulation, which you can see is high risk and low efficacy. And some of the other things there were identified as having, they needed to decrease the risk or they needed to increase the efficacy before they were worth trialing. So that was kind of the output from this process. It was interesting when this group of scientists were talking about how to make this stuff happen. Because they were saying, well, the Nagoya Protocol on prohibiting the transfer of genetic materials between nations without the permission of, say, indigenous peoples or people who have the ownership of the genetic material was an obstacle to the possibility of creating a distribution of genetic material throughout the area, and that regulators were too risk adverse and they weren't allowing them to do so. It was a question. Governance was an obstacle. If we could just remove governance, we could be a lot more effective. And I see a wry smile coming from David. I'm sure you experienced this in some of your discussions with scientific colleagues. The idea was that, regulators were, politicians, people, communities were standing in the way of trialing these necessary interventions. And we needed to find some way to reduce the resistance of people to trying these things out. And so, who decides? Not on the table. Legitimacy of doing these things, not really on the table. On what basis do we decide? It wasn't really discussed. It wasn't on the agenda, but when we were putting the paper together later, I was, again, kind of a fly on the wall as all this scientific discussion took place. At a certain point, they said, we need to write a policy brief. And there was silence in the room. There were about 30 people online, and there was just dead silence. And my mic was off because I was just kind of seeing myself as an observer at that point. But I was like, click. I was like, that's kind of my stock and trade, and I would be happy to help you with that. And they're like, great, why don't you work with us to write a policy brief? And this was sponsored by the Coral Restoration Consortium. So a large-scale NGO was willing to distribute this brief. So we got to work, and I actually found the process invigorating. And they were very open to ideas about governance. They weren't familiar with them. But once we started to put them on the table and talk about them, they were very eager to embrace some of these ideas. And so in the end, the policy brief ended up identifying these conditions for implementation, for intervention. Depends on relationships that you need to develop trust, you need to have dialogue, you need to engage in knowledge exchange between scientists and other non-scientific knowledge practitioners. Governance needs to be aligned with ecological urgency. Risk is a catalyst, not a constraint. It's not, we need to think of risk as something that can help motivate this process as opposed to prevent it because people are risk adverse. And then this set of recommendation emerged from this process of I propose ideas to them, they'd respond. I had hundreds of comments to respond to. It was a lot of fun, actually. And so this one is kind of where the rubber hits the road for me. I put it at the end, so not to, gave them all the good stuff that they were looking forward to. But the idea of reframing risk as experimentation. This is about governance is part of the experimental frame. It's not just the science that is on the table here in terms of how we should be trying novel things. And they were very accepting of this. It wasn't a resistance. It was more of a kind of unfamiliarity with this language and these possibilities. There's hope. in other words. And so where did I get out of this? This policy brief experience. I thought scientists can be our partners in these efforts. It's just the context that you introduce them into the setting. It's not their problem alone to address. So this is the next stage of our work together in Roatan and globally. And so working with a postdoc named Haley, who is located in Hawaii, I've been working with her on a large-scale kind of meta-analysis of different community-based conservation case studies. And the idea is to kind of get a compendium of what are the governance experiments that are going on in different projects around the world, and to assemble them into a kind of, I guess you could say, a kind of atlas of innovation, and look for certain associations between different kinds of governance intervention and different kinds of technical and scientific intervention to help corals. So we're trying to get a lay of the land, but we also want to use this as an active resource when we engage with communities. And so that's the plan. After we've created this kind of understanding of what kind of governance / scientific innovation is taking place in disparate communities around the world, we want to take this resource to communities as a way of fostering dialogue and giving them an open sense of possibility, but not dictating the outcome, saying this is what your colleagues in the world are doing. It's up to you to decide on what is the right pathway for yourself. Easier said than done, of course. So basically, that's what we plan. Vicky and I plan, both in Roatan and elsewhere, to kind of use a multi-level perspective model, the idea of fostering niche innovations and looking for how they might scale to impact. That's kind of our conceptual framework for this study, and see how these different innovations are being, are appearing around the world, and seeing which ones of these niches have the potential to thrive in very different and specific communities. So it's going to be a very interesting, still undeveloped project. And so I was so delighted to be paired in this session with people who've actually done the community engagement component, that we're still just at the beginning stages of planning. So I'm really looking forward to learning from Ignacio and our other speaker. Is she here? I hope so. Oh, there you are. Good. About your work, both in doing this very kind of thing that we're trying to get started. We hope to learn from you and perhaps even partner with you in your efforts. So thank you very much. And who's next? I think you're next.
Thanks. Let's see if I can. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Bruce, for the invitation to participate in this session. Unlike Vicky, and a little bit more close to you, Bruce, I'm not a coral reef guy. My background is not coral reef science, so it's. I thought that it was good to make this clear for the very beginning to where I come from. I'm a Uruguayan. In Uruguay, we don't have warm water coral reefs, so it might be weird that Uruguayan guy is talking about desirable coral reef futures. But actually, I'm presenting today together with Laura, but I'm also presenting it on behalf of a much broader group of researchers and scientists working in academia and NGOs, which they do have a lot of experience in coral reefs in diverse geographies. And what is interesting is that we do have this experience on facilitating groups, and that's where I will be talking from today, right? In this role of facilitating a process of creation of desirable futures. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, Bruce, but we don't have community involvement in this process, which might be actually something very desirable, but in every single process you have also limitations, right? And who is in the room. And in this case, in the room, there was mostly people with academic background working in academia or NGOs. So that's the first bias that I want to introduce straight away, right? This presentation comes from a very academic background. And let's try also to discuss how can we inject plurality in this process together. So I'm not going to go through the problems that coral reef face. Some of these problems were already mentioned, but I'm sure that you also have quite a good knowledge about the situation of coral reefs. But what I wanted to express is that these dystopian outlooks of coral reefs can become like very depressing and self-perpetuating, right? And we can feel like hopeless, that there's nothing else that we can do. But we kind of know that without transformative actions, these bleak futures are likely to realize. And that's the problem. And that's why we think that creating visions of preferable futures, it's something that it could be useful. It's not, again, it's not the solution, it's not the only solution, but it's part of the solution. Because we think it could empower people, both the participants of this process, which is a very like direct output of this process, but also other people that could engage with these outcomes. And hopefully could also foster decision makers to find solutions or to refine solutions in unexpected spaces, which are not only technical fixes solutions, right? The process that I'm going to talk about today is basically a process of visioning process, which is grounded in two main frameworks. The first one is the Zeta of good Anthropocenes, which basically proposes that any future will need to leverage what exists in the present, right? So there's already things happening in the ground which could feed those futures. And these seeds, called like metaphorically, they're initiatives that represent diverse worldviews, values, and across different regions and provide innovative and bottom-up solutions. And we combine this idea with the nature future frameworks, which is something that IPBES have developed and also has been work led by Laura. And the nature futures framework is basically an heuristic that supports the development of scenarios and models that capture desirable futures for nature and people. And the interesting thing of this framework is that it has the ability to capture the relational aspects of these relationships, right? The intrinsic value of of nature, and also the instrumental values of nature, right? So, and these three values of nature are captured in this triangular space in which the corners are nature for nature, representing the intrinsic values, nature for society, representing the instrumental values, and nature as culture, representing the relational values. And probably everyone here situates themselves in different spaces there, right? There's no like single space to situate, but it's variable for everyone. And what is also interesting is that in the ocean space, this framework hasn't been used so much, right? Today, there's only like published one example of the desirable visions for the ocean, particularly in the high seas. So, as I was telling you, this has been an expert-driven process, and the objective of this process was to envision desirable futures, and particularly by creating engaging narratives. Yeah, and this is something that is going to pop up later in the presentation. And the second huge objective of this process is also to outline actionable pathways, right? Not only what are the visions of desirable futures, but how to get there. And not by only like a single pathway, but multiple pathways. So without entering into details, we have basically a visioning process, which it was a workshop, but also follow-up activities in the last year. And only to like show a little bit of how we end up in these visions that I will show later. Basically, we use quite of a standardized method to envision desirable futures through a method that is called Manoa mashup methods, in which you imagine a seed, these seeds of good Anthropocene that I was mentioned before, and you imagine how this seed will look like in the future, right? And then you start thinking about what are the impacts of this seed across different categories, like social, technological, environmental, economic, and politics and values, right? And you think about the primary impacts and you think about the secondary impacts. And then you do it like again for another seed. And in that process, you are creating a kind of like an influence map of how these different seeds interact, where the tensions arise, what are the synergies. So that's like a process that helps participants to kind of like build the skeletons. But then you need to like also foster to put flesh on those futures. And that's what you also ask participants about, like, how do you experience this future that you are creating? And for doing that, we use the ethnographic future frameworks, or BERG as well. And then you ask directly, what is a healthy coral reef in the future that you are thinking? Is exactly the same as today we define a healthy coral reef, or 20 years before? So in that process, you kind of like outline and flesh the visions together with the working groups. And finally, and to foster this creativity, which is kind of like an interesting aspect of this process, we basically offer characters so participants can wave into their storylines to make it like a little bit more memorable, right? And in this process is how like we create desirable futures, right? In this structure process, we start with the seeds of change, like scattered across the nature future framework, and we develop over time desirable futures which are somewhere in that triangle. In particular, in this process, we wanted to combine two different human-nature relationships, right? So every single vision is a combination either of nature for nature and nature for society, or nature for nature, nature's culture, and so on. And once we have those visions, we come back and we try to think, okay, what are the actions that we need to do to like make these visions to grow and work towards them? And what are the things that we need to phase out for these visions to emerge? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the results of this process. Basically, what we achieved is like 3 visions of desirable futures, which have like catchy names as Riftopia, Project Refoire, of the Bay Revolution. And without entering in specific details, what I wanted to say is that these desirable visions not only represent different combinations of human-nature relationships, as was telling before, they also represent a diverse context, diverse time horizons, diverse key events or symbols or nature contributions to people, right? So they're quite diverse in the way they look. And we think about these desirable visions across dimensions, you can see that they are quite different, right? Even though they are desirable, they could be different. And that's quite interesting to see. And in particular, the 3 visions kind of like speak to different type of futures. Futures that are more strategic, which are the futures that are more aligned with the actual strategies that are on ground, which is kind of more like a continuation of what's going on. Futures that are more adaptive, or futures that are more transformative, futures that are more radical. And in this process, also something important is to outline these pathways. And I won't have time to enter in details of these pathways, but the important thing here is that in this process, even though it's desirable futures, because coral reefs are so close to the blink, to a biophysical collapse, all groups acknowledge that social ecological shocks are like, they're inevitable. They will happen. So we have both anticipatory responses and adaptive responses, acknowledging that shocks are inevitable. And the important thing here is that most discussions about pathways, they weren't about coral reefs per se. They were about like addressing the system, like the system that is basically doesn't allow of coral reefs to thrive, right? So like consumption, production, of course, climate change, that's the first thing, step 0. And then we go more into like interventions, right? Those specific interventions that also like take us to different types of futures. An important thing about this is how participants experience these processes, because one of the outcomes of the envisioning process is how like participants feel after the experience of visioning desirable futures. And I just wanted to bring some like quotes of the potential of this process, but also the challenges, right? And for me, something that it's really important is to see how this process elicits hope and that they're sometimes more important than the outcomes per se. That they provide the big picture thinking, and they provide inspiration and commitment, that they provide a space for creative thinking and letting go as well. That could be liberating and fun and eye-opening, right? But this is a part, of course, but also it brings challenges of, like, for example, moving beyond established mental processes, or navigating instances where there are different ideas of what a desirable future would look like. And this is our kind of the impacts this process have within the groups that develop these futures. But I also want to talk a little bit about the process that came after the visioning process itself, because we, as I said at the beginning, we acknowledge that this process was somehow homogeneous in terms of the people that participated. So we wanted to inject a little bit of plurality later on. So that's what an art science collaboration with Kim started, which was like a really amazing experience. She's an artist from Mauritius, which has a deep connection with the ocean, in particular with coral reefs. And something that is, for me, was very interesting to hear about there is that she considers a learner of neo-indigenous ways, right? Because in Mauritius, there's no indigenous population. So a lot of people are learning there how to like relate with nature, as kind of like develop a neo-indigenous knowledge. And that was like something really interesting that resonates a lot. And throughout this process, that it was like a process, iterative process of 5 months, we've learned a lot from each other. And I had a conversation beforehand this session, and I just wanted to bring some of their quotes because I wanted to have her as well in this presentation. And one of the things that were really nice about what she was thinking is that she really valued the freedom to basically question and our assumptions and challenge the worldviews together, right? Have that space of creative freedom to challenge the assumptions that the group, the working groups have previously developed, and trying to like kind of like tweak and find a way that she could like stand before those results and not feel uncomfortable. And something that it was also quite interesting throughout this process is that like 2024 was one of the years of the 4th global bleaching event, one of the worst situation for coral reefs, and we were like thinking about desirable futures. And it was kind of like a cognitive dissonance in this process. And we talked about this a lot. And she was saying that when she was like in the reef diving, like seeing the devastation underwater and like surfacing and seeing the people smiling on the beach and the boats, it was really like a powerful image of disconnect of people and nature. And she's described this as senseless monkeys we are, basically. And I really... I know that everyone here is kind of like a coral reef fan. I really recommend to visit her webpage to see some of her amazing art and processes. So these are the results in artistic format. As I said, there are like 3 desirable futures: Reeftopia, Reef Art Project, and the Bay Revolution. I won't have time to describe them all because it's very, very, very long texts that address these visions. But I also wanted to bring another quote from Kim, which is the role of imagination in this process as a space of salvation, right? And art as being able to counter dominant narratives. So if you want to know more about these desirable futures, one of the ways that you can do it is like right away, like go to the Radical Ocean Futures webpage. The futures are already like posted there, only 2. Hopefully we will post the 3rd one in a few days. And one thing is important here is that these futures are not prescriptive at all. We're not saying what we should do. It's like one of the multiple and diverse ideas of the futures that are out there. So this is one of the examples that adds to the collection of transformative futures for the ocean. So I also invite you to explore other futures about in this webpage about Radical Ocean Futures. In there, you're going to find the artworks and you're going to find the full narratives. It's storylines with characters, with the events, and that are or we think that could be engaging to share. And hopefully these artworks will become as a living art piece in which there's going to be movement. And also hopefully we will develop some sort of audio drama, which is kind of like a podcast or short podcast. And as an example of how this visioning process could have like a direct impact or can support policy action, this project, the Coral Reef Futures, was featured at UNOC 3 in a high-level blue zone event, which was focused on protecting climate-resilient reefs, which was very interesting because one of the stories was particularly about this climate-resilient coral reefs. This event was organized by the government of Papua New Guinea and supported by a lot of other organizations. And 11 governments basically signed an agreement to protect these climate-resilient coral reefs as a source of basically as a safety net for the future, basically. You can also access the commitment in the link. So what we have done basically is to create different visions for the desirable futures for coral reefs, which capture different nature perspectives, and we have embodied those in artworks. We have discussed about new solution spaces, not only about interventions, but also when we need to step back, for example. We developed, and this is something that we are still doing, is transformation pathways, and trying to be as collaborative, as transparent as possible during this research process. And the idea is to offer this diverse and preferable futures which are grounded in diverse human-nature relationships. The goal is to bring inspiration, creativity, and hope, and refresh perspectives, right? And hopefully, these futures will be featured as case studies in different high-level processes, for example, in IPBES, in the upcoming global assessment, or in Earth Commission as part of the Transformation Pathways workstream. So thank you very much for your attention. And I just want to also acknowledge all the co-authors that have been part of this process. Yeah, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just start with a couple of words of acknowledgement. So this is a presentation with my collaborator, author, Samantha Stone-Jovicic, who I work with at CSIRO in Townsville, Australia. And Ada Gray here is from Peak Global, also based in Australia. Samantha and I are both sort of social and integration or interdisciplinary researchers. Ada is a professional facilitator, but in this project, she worked with us very closely over years to first co-design the process with us and with the others that I'll talk about in this presentation. So very much a partner in a way that facilitators often aren't. So I think that's a novel intervention in itself. Where do I want to go with this? We gave a Spark talk earlier today. I don't think that many people would have seen that, except I know one has. And until about 1 o'clock today, we thought we would just give an extended version of that. And then we looked at the brief again and thought, I think we want to do this a little bit differently. So I hope it works. Anyway, okay. So the background to this, we know coral reefs are in crisis. And as a result, despite decades of really good management practices and strategies in the Great Barrier Reef, there was a recognition that that's not sufficient to deal with the current and future pressures facing the reef. And so there's a shift from kind of more conventional management of the ecosystem to kind of broader social ecological systems and to a whole range of threats. And with this comes I guess, a more proactive willingness to accept that there might need to be some restoration or adaptation interventions that previously would not have been on the table to support the reef's resilience now and into the future. So I'm going to be talking about work that was done within the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, or RAP, This is a multi-institutional partnership involving various Australian universities and governments. It's funded by the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, which in turn is funded by the Australian federal and Queensland governments. And the aim of that is it is a collaboration of scientists and engineers and other experts. I'll talk more about the community involvement and other stakeholders in a moment. It's the world's largest effort to help a significant ecosystem, being the Great Barrier Reef, to survive climate change. And it is aiming to provide a toolkit of interventions. So it's a suite of interventions and looking at how these might work in concert to help protect the reef from climate change. And importantly, it has to be at a scale that can make a difference. So obviously, kind of piecemeal, small-scale approaches are not going to do the job. The program has a dedicated engagement focus. So this is kind of the overview of the structure. So there are various different reef interventions that are being trialed, but we've got all these supporting and cross-cutting subprograms as well. So there's significant investment made into engagement, stakeholders, traditional owners, and communities more broadly. So that's positive for us. Now, community panels is the approach that I'm going to be talking about, which Ada and I were involved in. And this is happening at a time where these two major trends are intersecting. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, we have this paradigm shift calling for new and citizen-centered approaches to engagement. So because we're looking at sort of a bigger suite of threats and pressures and opportunities, that just implies a broader range of people that need to be involved in the conversation. So these are new approaches to engagement underpinned by social and transdisciplinary science. And I'll just say that the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program is very much a multi-pronged approach. So it's not intending to be a replacement for other responses to climate change, including obviously reducing emissions. So it's not in place of, it is in tandem with that. Thank you. And then on the other hand, there's been this surge of demand for greater participation of the public in science and technology decision-making. And you see things like this, a thriving society. There are a whole bunch of reasons why this is important. Trust, and I thought this is important. This is the NGO Involve from the UK that talks about trusting the public. We always talk about the importance of trusting science and scientists, but it's a two-way street, right? It has to be mutual. And then, of course, there have been lots of scientific papers on the importance of public engagement, ethics advisor. So that's, tested ways to bring the public into research decisions, and global governance that can be informed by deliberative processes composed of citizens. That's just a few examples of many. So the community panels in RAP are geographically based spaces for community members to engage in facilitated structured deliberation with the scientists that are trialing these interventions over an extended period of time. The approach is adapted from the Participatory Technology Assessment Model, or PTAPs, that's been used for several decades. The focus of these two panels was on marine cloud brightening and different corals interventions. And this involved between 12 and 18 members. So we had two panels, one with 12, one with 18, through an open call expression of interest to really aimed at gauging what people's reef connections and interests were. And this is one of multiple complementary engagement activities. So it was not meant to be the only mode or form of engagement. It was meant to be done alongside many others. There was a panel roadmap developed with the community. So the process ran over, in one panel it was 7 months, one 10 months. So that sort of time period, and involved a lot of preparatory work and post work. And in the middle was this, we like to use the metaphor of the canoe, the meeting canoe. So you have sort of an opening, a process of sharing, exploring, and deliberating, and then closing again. And that just shows the overall structure and what happened in the individual workshops. So some of the things that roadmap involved was firstly to set and establish foundations. Actually, am I supposed to hand over to you? Stealing your thunder there.
Yes, so one of the things that we from the outset established was that this was going to be a deeper, longer, slower engagement, and that gave us some time at the beginning, but throughout, to create that foundation of not only understanding the work that was being done, but really starting to trust each other and really moving from an advocacy-based one-way dialogue with scientists, with sharing knowledge about the interventions and community sharing their concerns. It became much more of an open dialogue. And what really helped with that was starting with what are our connections to the reef, so storytelling. One example was one of the scientists actually grew up in Japan and spoke about how his connection to the reef started watching documentaries, but developed such a love for the reef. And so we had all these different stories coming out, which became that common anchor that grounded the work. So there were some site visits, there were some introductions and explanations and visioning, collective visioning. One of the approaches that worked really well was finding a different way to look at risks and opportunities. It was also seen as not just a binary, it's good or it's bad, but it was about sharing perspectives. So what we would do is we'd get the community panel to identify from what they understood about the interventions, risks and opportunities. And then we asked the scientists, without knowing what the community came up with, we asked the scientists to predict what they thought the community members might say, and then to write down what, through their experience and through their research, they have found. And that was a really eye-opening process. First of all, I think scientists were quite surprised that the community members knew quite a few of those just from their lived experience, but also community members feeling that they're contributing to the knowledge of the researchers because they came up with risks and opportunities that the scientists hadn't actually thought of. So the other great opportunity was to take an existing intervention assessment framework, and the community panel actually massaged that framework to work for them and the work that they wanted to do. So one thing, for example, getting back to the point that was made that risks weren't only seen as a negative, but it was actually, we asked the question and they helped us devise the framework where, what is the challenge here? Who should be involved in exploring it? And what might those experiments look like? And what might those indicators for moving forward or maybe taking a bit longer look like? And then what we did at the end is connecting them back to their visions for the reef. Asked the question, what did you appreciate most? And one of the panels, quite representative of some of the feedback that was given, was just that sense of agency, that community members felt that their voices were really being listened to. They really had a right and a responsibility to engage around reef interventions. Also, the fact that it was fresh perspectives. One of the community panel members said, I know only one person in this room, and that's a great thing because we'll have some fresh perspectives, as well as the fact that there was a real appreciation for scientists not only being open, scientists saying when they didn't know, scientists saying, and program managers where things weren't being done the way they would have perhaps liked it. And that openness and vulnerability really opened that space of trust, but also the fact that community members felt that it was so affirming to hear from researchers, that's a good idea. This is something we haven't thought about yet. So that great validation. And then lastly, that sense of hope that quite a few have already spoken about. So in summary, almost, the great eye-opener of what deep dialogue could really surface and the trust that could build, but also how just being with a group of similar-minded people, all caring for the reef, knowing how much effort and brain power almost is going into finding these solutions and interventions, and that they felt that they could really contribute to it. So we had that quote around, even if one of the sentences or paragraphs that we came up with might facilitate that one tiny catalyst with the butterfly wings flapping and then causing that ripple. So I don't know if you wanted to talk to the ripple framework, I can hand back to you.
Yeah, and I think the importance is because, these are only small numbers of people, but the idea is that can scale up in different ways. And we chose the metaphor of the ripples of impact because obviously the reef and ocean, more than like pathways, which is, also applicable. But so things like being a sounding board, contributing knowledge, insights, and experience on reef actions that could actually be taken through the pilot deployment that was that followed this process in RAP. Communications and awareness raising and visibility was really important because that could obviously extend that impact and make people more aware beyond those few who participated. So sharing that through their networks, connecting others in, so reaching out to other groups, youth, which was identified as an underrepresented group or a gap, and connecting them into reef actions. And then connecting out to others, engaging in other reef networks and actions. Those were some of the envisioned ways that this panel could have impact. Okay. And so I think this is just to basically summarize that this was working towards an inclusive deliberative approach. So what was key to realize impact? I think things in the process like being responsive to feedback, adapting on the go, and not being too, rigid or, sort of predetermined. It had to be evolving. And scientists committing to and trusting the engagement process was really key as well. The independent facilitator and the long engagement period. But there are also some ongoing questions for us and challenges and tensions that accompany that. So when a panel like this is not representative or stakeholder-based, and there are obviously lots of advantages of it being a citizen-based initiative, but what is its influence and reach? And how can they engage the less engaged or even disengaged? How do you tap into those groups that aren't part of the conversation? We asked a lot about our capacities to sustain momentum beyond the panel. How should we as researchers do that? Could we, should we? All those questions. And then how to connect outputs and learnings from this panel to the complex and evolving decision-making structures of a big program like RAP. And I think it was interesting, I'll just add here, because I think, Vicki, you said something about, even though the sort of entry point for you was talking about the sunscreen, that ended up being part of a much bigger conversation. And I think that was certainly true here too, even though we were talking about these reef interventions, it was an opportunity to look much broadly at reef issues and how to manage those, and to build that capacity for engagement in a deliberative way. And with that, I'll just acknowledge the participants in those two panels in Townsville and Cairnsport Douglas, and the funding agencies and the others who were involved in that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the presenters for that. Can I suggest we have 20 minutes on the schedule, so why don't the presenters already bring your chairs around to the front so we can, and maybe in a bit of a circle, so it's more of a conversation with the room while I make a commentary, I suppose. So this is really interesting. I'm very grateful to being here in this, because as a coral reef scientist, and one dealing with reefs disappearing, and a lot of my colleagues have gone into coral restoration research and so on, which I haven't really done in our context in East Africa, and there are other groups doing that. So what this presentations or sets of presentations were all about were really process, which is really interesting to me. Whereas the discussions I've been in with other coral reef scientists on coral reef restoration has been a lot about this method or that method, or this is the solution, or this is going to work better than that one. And I think what we really heard here is about the building the process to work out what potential solutions may be. I think, yes, please feel free to move as needed, anybody. So process is really important, clearly. We lost our youngest member, which is a shame. The second thing was that these are all very much around joint work and pathways. So, bringing groups together. And I think we heard that the sense that people come into these spaces and see that there is actually much more to gain from joint work and deliberations and moving forward. And then lastly, that while they're dealing with a particular challenge up front, and there are other challenges in the future, will the discussions on this present challenge really produce a solution? We don't really know because that's part of the deliberative process and the trials, but we're building the social capital, I suppose, and the governance capital to, one, deal with that problem, but also that can be leveraged in future contexts as well, the next challenges that arise down the road also. And I think that was very interesting to hear that. And so I think that's very, very cool, to use not a very technical term, to hear in this process, because of course I think we do have so many interweave challenges that we're facing. But with that, I think I'll open it up. We had initially put in the abstracts, I think perhaps anticipating a bit more time to have sort of 2-on-2 discussions, but I think let's go straight into discussion. You can have direct questions to panelists if you like, or perhaps observations, because of course I'm sure many of you in the audience have your experience in these contexts too. So let's just open that up. Laura.
Thanks so much, everyone. Reflection, thoughts, and it was really, so Manana gave a presentation in our workshop yesterday afternoon, which was on anticipatory governance, tipping points, imagination, storytelling, and something that I've been struggling with in this work, and particularly around the tipping points report that we've got the second round coming up now. And from the Earth Commission side, the science is clear, 1.5 threshold. There are these thresholds effects. You can't sort of skirt around some of these things, but that's very disempowering. You don't have agency at the local level to make sure that we stay below 1.5 degrees. Obviously, there's, as you were saying, a lot of work that we can do. And so I find myself writing into some of this, the framing, to try and bring some of that agency back. Sunscreen, for example, right, seems small, can have a big impact. Watershed management. What are some of the things you can actually do to have healthier reefs, where the whole reef might not be surviving, but you might not go into sort of algal-filled complete tipping points, right? You might still have some semblance of a reef. And then, so what are some of those more climate resilient, the things you can do on the ground that we can use, not to counter a narrative of imminent tipping, but to still provide agency or actions to people on the ground who are so dependent on these ecosystems. So I find it very difficult to write with no hope, right? To say like, this is it. At what point do we just throw our hands up in the air and say tipping points, this is now cascading impact. It's too late to act. I mean, it's never too late to act, but sometimes there's biophysical reality. So that's just something that I've been reflecting on and trying to see how we could actually incorporate those ways a little bit better, staying true to the science, but still providing options for hope. And I think that's what we were kind of grappling with the Coral Reef Futures project.
Maybe answer first. Oh. If you can, that'd be great.
I think that's what those Caribbean scientists were orienting toward. And there were radical interventions in some cases, like moving corals between ocean basins, or relying instead on sort of artificial coral structures. Genetic modifications of the corals themselves or their algal symbionts, so it's not recognizable in terms of the evolutionary pathway, but it might be functional for the communities in terms of their reliance on fish and juvenile fisheries and that sort of thing. So I think that maybe is that. I think that's sort of that intermediate domain that you're kind of referring to. But of course, who's governing those interventions, who's monitoring, paying for, who's benefiting from, all those questions need to be answered.
I just feel like you have to have hope. And I know in one respect you're responding to documents, but if you are working with communities or youth or anybody, if you don't really try to find that little diamond in the rough, people are just going to give up. And that's the last thing we want people to do, is feel like they have no hope. So I'm always trying to incorporate that when I am doing presentations or working with the communities that I have opportunities to maybe influence or at least provide some kind of insight. Because without hope, like, what's the point?
If I can say something on that briefly as well. So the challenge I've always had in both in science and in conservation framings is we always look for the optimal. We always look for the best, to put our efforts, because you get supposedly the most bang for your buck. But communities don't have the luxury of just giving up, because they do have to continue to fish or develop their livelihoods and so on. So we need to really identify what is the condition of each location in order to identify the best or viable responses to find a better pathway than a worse one. So there's a coral reef paper way back when titled A Slippery Slope to Slime. We don't just have to give up on coral reefs completely, because what we call coral reefs right now could still be very healthy rocky reef or algal or invertebrate reefs in the future, but just not dominated by hard corals, so long as we make sure there's no pollution and that fisheries and so on are managed sustainably. So we do need to deal with future contexts in every location, particularly for the people who are most dependent on that space, and not to get stuck in. And this is a little bit the colonial narrative, is from afar we can say, okay, well, that place there's no hope. Okay, so we'll turn our attention to Indonesia or something like that, because the reefs there are still better. But that doesn't help East Africa, at all. So that's, I think, one of the things that's really important in the debates that we have. Margot has her hand up, so let me switch to another topic.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm Margot from Canada, and excellent presentations, excellent discussions. And this is for everybody but Bruce. Did I get that right? Okay. A little bit for you, because you on your slide had the different interventions you just spoke to so eloquently. This is a real window of opportunity, because I'll call it geoengineering, but there are different grades. And I saw some of your descriptions dealing with DNA and changes genetically. And some people find these very disruptive. So there's conflict. So this is for everybody, in the sense that you're all doing fantastic work, working in community, but there's always conflict. So where in the models and the engagement, where are the processes and practices around that conflict? And I worry, not in this context, but about the binaries we have in our societies, the opposites, the echo chambers, the not listening to each other, not wanting to hear conflict, which we need to hear. And how do we deal with this? So it's really for everybody.
Thanks for that question. Something that resonated with me about what you were asking is that in this process of creating the desirable futures, like, people were kind of like steered to think in a certain direction towards, like, for example, nature as culture, nature for nature, and like not necessarily all the participants were like identified with those type of like human nature relationships, but the process of navigating, like, perspective that they might not agree, or futures that they may entirely agree, was quite a wide opening to, like, sit it basically in the other side of where you sit. So in that sense, these kind of processes which you kind of like expose participants to values that they might not identify is also quite eye-opening for a lot of them. And it was the same with the artistic process, because I've got in touch with her and said, like, okay, we have this process ongoing, but I know that this is kind of like already like an ongoing process and you're jumping in, but I don't want you to like embody these nice stories. I want you to like back the stories and like reshape everything and like try to make your own stories about for this. And for her, it was very challenging, actually, some of the stories. So, but in that process, you learn a lot as well. So I think exposing people to other perspectives, it's quite useful.
Anyone else?
I feel like I should say something, but I'm not sure what. Oh, I thought you were going to take the mic. I guess that's one of the aims of the deliberative engagement process, like the community panel, is to, surface those different views and provide a space for conflict to be negotiated or at least made visible. There wasn't a lot of conflict in those meetings. And I think that was because, to some extent, they were like-minded participants. We did spend a lot of time just creating that space so that people, understood that we were trying to be constructive and not that we were trying to diminish the potential for conflict, but I think just it was very much about it was constructive. And at the same time, we weren't aiming for consensus or anything either. We were acknowledging the different values and diversity. I think one challenge for us is that the people who likely would have wanted to engage in conflict weren't putting their hands up to participate in the first place. And so that is, it's kind of like the next frontier with these processes. I think we need to, it's not like preaching to the choir. I wouldn't go that far, but you do have a lot of people with that shared, those shared values in the room, whereas perhaps we don't have enough of those who don't quite agree with the whole idea of not even just intervening in the reef, but the fact that, they don't think there's a problem. It's like the reef's fine. There's a lot of that. That's a really strong narrative in the Great Barrier Reef, and it gets amplified in the media. So, yeah.
I also thought that what gave community panel members more confidence was knowledge of robust governance frameworks and risk frameworks that were collaboratively developed and didn't only take into account the science, but also some of the perspectives and decision-making criteria. I think that from an external facilitator's perspective, that gave, I thought, the community more trust in the process.
When Vicky and I were at the Reef Futures Conference, there was such enthusiasm over certain kinds of technological fixes where you might grow a chunk of coral reef and then replace it on the reef, and it would grow back. And there was a powerful narrative about how these people are heroes, the Reef Restoration Corps, and yet it was a kind of a response to reef decline that avoided conflict. It avoided any engagement with the deeper structural forces that Vicky noted that the Roatan Marine Park director was all too aware of. So I think maybe there's already a tendency for sort of hero narratives within the coral reef restoration field that are for ineffective solutions that are easy because they're acceptable to powerful forces that would otherwise we'd have to actually be in conflict with. I'm curious about your perspective on that, because I know you've had a lot more experience than I have in that field.
Yes, certainly. I've found there is that hero narrative that can be very strong, also because people and scientists, are very engaged in a particular thing, and this can work, and so they want to find ways to make it more and more effective, and they, truly believe that it can scale, but not necessarily very aware of all the background forces that make it very difficult, and also some of the broader constraints around these things. I mean, I was thinking that one of the other narratives that's really important in this, and Margot, you used the term geoengineering, because I think it's a very important one, is that there are certain technical fixes that sort of get put into the discourse through some sort of modeling, visioning processes done through computer models. Carbon sequestration is a typical one there. And while we know they don't work right now, the models say that if they do work at this scale, they will be a solution. So they really get pushed forward. And some of the proponents of these things know that it would be a real challenge, but a way to keep the discussion alive is to keep them, in these sorts of discourses about, is it a potential future technology, even though, there's a lot of doubts around them now. So being very cognizant of the limitations of many of these opportunities is really important, the current limitations, and then also making sure that there are voices in the room in the science that are very much around governance, and so that there is a point at which, somebody, and whose voice would it be, there do need to be some voices that are able to say, look, there just isn't enough propping this up. So, this is not really a viable alternative. These ones perhaps are more acceptable, and so on. But there's a hand at the back, and we probably have time just for this one last one, and we'll see a comment.
Thanks. So my name's Miranda. I'm originally from Australia, but I work in Germany now. Really interesting to hear what's happening with, I would call it solar geoengineering in Australia, given that like maybe 15 years ago we said if solar geo is ever used, it will be to protect something of cultural significance, like the Great Barrier Reef. And here we are today, right? So interesting to see that happening. I work on the other kind of geoengineering, which is much more, related to what you talk about. So in Germany, we have a research mission called CDR Mare, which is about the role of the ocean in potential role of the ocean in drawing down additional CO2 from the atmosphere. And it's a very much, as you said, bringing people together in a very diverse way to talk about not only the potential infeasibility or feasibility of some of these things, but also the potential desirability or undesirability of these things. And we're doing it with futuring methods and bringing together very diverse people into the room. And it's fascinating. Like so many of the things that you have mentioned, I can completely identify with. Like the techno-optimistic natural scientist who's just like, I'm just trying to save the world, let me do it. And then the ethicists who are, arguing about the moral significance of benthic organisms in the sediment, so it's great to bring these people into conversation. So yeah, just really interesting to hear your experiences and reflect on how they relate to my experiences. And one thing I just wanted to flag was I think this ongoing split between what we're discussing as techno-fixes and what is being described as protection or restoration, the line is blurring. It's very, very blurred now. And all of the proponents of some of these approaches also now take on this different narrative. We wrote a paper about the rise, fall, and rebirth of the idea of using the ocean as an enhanced carbon sink and the way the narratives have changed over time. And yeah, it's very difficult now. You can't, they're not talking about techno-fixes anymore. And this didn't come up. The solar geoengineering wasn't used once in your presentation. It was all about restoration and protection. And this is very much the case when it comes to ecosystem co-design and these sorts of things, which are still, I would argue, marine geoengineering, but they're not framed in that way at all anymore. So it's interesting to see this switch. Oh. So thank you very much. It was such an interesting panel.
Thank you very much. Can I give the microphone to the panel?
Well, I think just one other challenge, and I know that certainly in the RAP program, but also elsewhere, is better articulating, and that based on, again, conversation and lots of other processes, what we are trying to protect. We often talk about a suite of values associated with the reef, but what are those exactly, and for whom, and who decides, and all those questions. But I think that's something that we're not always that clear about. It's like, protecting the reef, saving the reef. Yeah, but what exactly,
I know it's running late, but I just wanted to end my comment with kind of going back to hope with, I see so many young people who are entering the ocean world, whether it was like almost 1,000 in Mexico doing coral restoration. And, they were in their 20s and 30s. And we all are familiar with shifting baselines. Like we know what the ocean looked like 20, 30 years ago. But I have people who say to me, I went on my first dive and it's magical. And we know it looks a lot different. but at the same time, you have people who care and love it. And so I think part of the conversation is balancing a lot of the technology that we know will be coming into the world of decision making and restoration, but also balancing what we've lost versus how we can keep the joy alive so people will continue to work in this field. And with that, I just want to say thanks for being here.